Happy Sunday to everybody. How are we all doing today? Today we are going to be talking about has to do with the ancient districts of Igboland and their contribution to the Igbo language. Yes, we are going to be looking at the development of the Igbo language, both written and spoken. Okay, now for us to fully understand what we are talking about, the first chapter we'll be talking about is the ancient districts of Igboland and their prominence. Okay, now when we talk about this, the Igboland used to be divided into districts. Igboland developed to the point that each area started to develop what you call district. That is to say, in a district you have people of diverse history, diverse ancestries, diverse migrations, but they find themselves in a common area. Talking about the districts of Igboland, the prominent ones, one of them was Elugu. There was an actual Elugu district in Igboland. There was an actual Elugu district. Now, this area, if you check the list of towns that were provided to Baikie, to be Elugu towns, Baikie actually wrote them down. If you see these communities, there are a lot of communities here. There should be more than 20 communities that were supplied as the district of Elugu. Now, where was this Elugu? Elugu is the area that is mostly Anambra today, up to the point of some parts of Enugu state. So all these areas, it was that big. All these areas went by the name Elugu. So if you said Anmeje Elugu, you are actually going to these areas back then. So this was the name several communities of diverse histories were using to describe their area of Igbo land, just like a district. So they called themselves the people from the Elugu district. That is for the Elugu district. It was that big. Okay, you have another district that was called the Isuama district. This one also was very prominent as of the time Baikie was recording. Okay, now the Isuama district falls into what is mostly part of northern Imo state. And also when they leave that particular Isuama district trying to migrate somewhere else, they take the name to their new location. Now they don't take the full name Isuama, they just go by Isu, the Ama part. So just trying to put things into proper perspective so that some of our people don't get lost as they try to identify with district instead of their traditional place. Okay, so there was also the Aro district. Now back in the days, today you have Arochukwu. Back in the days, you just say Anmejaro. Now when you say Anmejaro, it might be the main town, Arochukwu, or it might be several other communities around the area. All that area was very prominent. In fact, it became one of the earliest cosmopolitan areas in Igboland. You will see how Aro contributed also in the second chapter. There was also the Abo district. When Abo was very prominent, there was the Abo district that was very large. There was also the Oru district. The Oru district mostly along the Non-River. The Non-River and also part of the Niger River up to the point between Anambra and Kogi State. All those places were Oru on both sides. So they came to be known by that, a kind of district, Oru district. Now there was also another district, there are several districts, but there was also a district that today you will call Agbaja. What you call Agbaja used to be Agbaja. Now the name Agbaja is actually Ndinachuaja. It's a variation of Ichuaja. So it turns out they were actually prominent in Dibia. Place came to be prominent for that work, and so they came to be known as Ndi Agbaja. If you look at this document is from the 1860s. You can see it. The person that was being interviewed told the missionary people that he's from Ogbajotolo in the Agbaja district. You can see how it is spelled, Agbaja district. So this is how these things actually shaped themselves. This is how the district used to be prominent back in time. Now the next thing we'll be looking at is how they actually contributed to the Igbo language. No, before I forget, the Isuama district, the Isu is actually a variation of Iru. It is actually Iruama. Some dialects call it Ifu, some call it Ivu with a V, some call it Ishu, and some call it Ihu. So there are several variations of that name, the most popular being Iru, because Iru tends to be found more in the central areas of Igboland. But that name Isuama is actually Iruama. So Iruama is like face of the people, face of the community, so to say. Now, by Igbo standard, if you consider one angle, the Iru there might actually mean representatives, because when you talk about Iru of so things, they're actually the representatives of something else. Okay, so having spoken about all that, we will now talk about the prominence of the Isuama and Elugu dialects. Now, Baikie was trying to find the central dialect of the Igbo language. Now, Baikie being a philologist is somebody that studies languages. Okay, now he being a philologist, he knew that there are certainly dialects that are more central in the Igbo language than the others, and so his commission was to find the central dialects. Now, they wanted to find this because the people who were interested in missionary work, who were actually in Sierra Leone, a lot of Igbo people actually think that missionary work was mostly from Britain. It wasn't necessarily from Britain, it was actually from Sierra Leone. And it was from the Igbo people in Sierra Leone, because the pioneer missionaries in Igboland were actually 3 Igbo men. In hinterland, on the coast, it was a different issue. So they had to find the central dialect so that they can speak in a dialect that is understood far and wide. And that was Baikie's work. That was what Baikie was trying to achieve, trying to find this central dialect. Now, he was in all these districts I've called before. He actually visited all of them at different times. Now, he was taking note of their dialects. Now, when he went to Aro, you see, Aro is at one extreme point of Igboland, okay? When he went to Aro, there was something he noticed. He noticed that there were 2 other dialects being spoken in Aro, apart from the Aro dialect, okay? In the other communities where he was visiting, they speak mostly their own. The only places where he got people speaking other dialects was in Onitsha, where they were speaking something of Elugu, that is general, what you call general Anambra Igbo. They were speaking Elugu. They were speaking Isuama also. Some were speaking Isuama. Some were also speaking the Onitsha dialect itself, which became separated. Okay, so Aro was another place he found that they were speaking other dialects also. And so he calculated that either of the Elugu or Isuama dialect would be more central. And so Isuama was what the missionaries worked with in learning the Igbo language, actually in Sierra Leone. You see, so when they came back, it turned out that it wasn't as central as they had thought. People did not understand it as much as they had thought the Igbo people would. And so that was a bit of a disappointing discovery for them. We go to the next chapter, which is actually Search for a Central Dialect, the making of Union Igbo, Central Igbo, and Igbo Izugbe. Now, what happened was that after the war in Sierra Leone in the 1860s thereabout, Baikie actually passed away. There's no much record that shows that war continued after Baikie. So that one seems to just have been put in the archive, so to say. So it came down to the early 1900s, and so the missionaries were still trying to get a dialect they can use in their work. And so somebody known as Father Dennis, he put together a team. What they did was that they got dialects from several parts of Igboland and joined them together to make one dialect. Their thinking was that if you can merge this dialect, whatever you come up with will be a sum of dialects, will be a dialect that has everybody's dialect in it, and so everybody will understand it. But that is not how Igbo language works. Okay, so when they put together what you know as Union Igbo and presented it to the Igbo people, many Igbo people could not really get what they were trying to communicate with. It wasn't as successful as they had thought it would be. Now you go to the next one. After that period of the early 1900s, somebody else was commissioned, this time by the British government. Now the British government, who were now interested in colonialism, they wanted to get the central dialect by all means. They needed it to be able to communicate with the Igbo people. So they got another philologist, another language expert by the name of Ida Caroline Ward. Please, Ida Caroline Ward is a woman. I've read some that actually was saying he was a man. So Ida Caroline Ward came to Igboland and also began work on the Igbo language. Now what she did was that she looked at Igboland and said, okay, probably the central Igbo dialect is closer to the Umuahia area, around the Umuahia to Owerri area, around those places, okay? And so that is where she got the core of the core of the words she used for the Igbo language to build what she wanted to build. That is where she got the core. Now, when she finished the work, she named it Central Igbo. That's what she called it. But also, just like the earlier work of the Union Igbo by Father Dennis, when they presented it, they also found that it wasn't as central as they had thought. It didn't have the required spread that the British government needed. Okay, so they were a bit disappointed. But the British government, because they couldn't keep contracting people to find this central dialect, so what they did was that they adopted her work. But they said, we will use this. Whether it is not as central as we think or not, we are going to use it. And so they adopted that work. They started using it for only government purposes. So at the end of the day, through some recommendations here and there, they came together and brought out what you know today as Igbo Izugbe. Igbo Izugbe. Okay? And so this is the reason why when we will talk about Igbo Izugbe sometimes, some people will tell you it is actually based on Umuahia. They are not wrong per se, because the Igbo Izugbe is actually a continuation of Central Igbo by Ida Caroline Ward. that was based on mostly Umaya and the Owerri dialects. Okay, so Igbo Izugbe just continued on that way, added some other things to make it more central in nature. And so that is how we got to the Igbo Izugbe we used to write today. It has worked for all these official declarations, but if you notice, the Igbo Izugbe, despite the fact it is studied in Igboland every year, it is written in WAEC, as far as I know, it is written in WAEC every year. Still, the use is very low. The use is almost 0%. And we are going to look into why that is the case in the next chapter, okay? The fourth chapter is the central dialect of the Igbo language. Its development, its spread, uses, and so on and so forth. Now, when we talk about the central dialect of the Igbo language, which Baikie was actually trying to look for, as we discussed in chapter 2, when we talk about the central dialects of the Igbo language, there are actually dialects that are closer to the center. Now, language is like a spectrum from the left to right. That is, it's like a line of dialects from the left to the right. There are some that are closer to the center, some are closer to the right, and some are closer to the left, okay? So there are some that are actually central, okay? Now, these dialects that are central, those that I had mentioned earlier, are closer to what you know as today's Anambra State, most part of Anambra State. Not all, because some dialects are not actually central in Anambra. So some dialects that fall into today's Anambra State, they are more central. They have a more wider range of comprehensibility. That is talking about the central dialect, actually, of the Igbo language. Now, we'll talk about its development. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the previous chapter, the Igbo people did not necessarily need to learn another dialect. The Central Igbo, or the use of something that closely resembles Central Igbo, came with the integration of Igboland. What do I mean by integration? As Igboland got more and more mixed up with modernity, as modernity was coming after colonization, independence, and all that, as we started to mix up, as clans started to mix up, they arose a need for a dialect that one can use to communicate with people from the far part of Igboland. So that is what actually brought out the prominence of the central dialects of Igboland. Before, it wasn't necessary. But as modernity comes, as you grow, as city centers grew out in Igboland, you have Onitsha city center, you have Oka, you have the Enugu metropolis, you have Owerri, you have Port Harcourt, even Agbaja is turned into a small city. Agbaja, you know, you have Asaba also. Asaba is also very developed today. As these areas are coming up, there was now need for something more central, because when you grow up in these areas, or when you are in these areas, you tend to meet people of other parts of Igboland who may not understand your dialect, and so you need to speak something more central. It's just like you have in the university town of Nsukka today. When you meet the local people and they speak to you, once they speak the Nsukka dialect and you do not grab what they are saying, they are smart enough and sensible enough to shift to something more central, and so when they speak again, you then understand what they are saying. You see, so that is how it is. That is what brought about the need for central dialect. Mixing up of Igbo clans, mixing up of Igbo people brought out the prominence of the central dialects. Okay, now talking about the importance and uses, it is very important. That is to say that when you meet an Igbo person who is a total stranger, who is also from another part of Igbo land that is not close to you, that central dialect connects both of you immediately. For the part that person just opens his mouth and speaks to you, and immediately you understand what is going on. In that moment, both of you are one. In that moment, unity has been planted in between both of you. So it's actually something that removes a barrier. It removes dialect barrier, so to say. It also fosters a bit of brotherliness between Igbo people, because you can see a group of 10 guys, for instance, from several areas in Igbo land. There's no way everybody can be speaking his own hometown dialect, because there will be lesser understanding. So what happens is that they switch to something more central, and everybody is carried along. Everybody understands what the next person is saying, and there is that brotherliness in that moment. So that is talking about the importance. Use is also, you get it mostly in the commercial sector of the Igbo people. When you go to the markets, there's a tendency that you hear a lot of central, you hear dialects that are more central in nature. When you go to all these international markets, not the rural markets in your community, we are talking about the international markets, the major markets, there's a tendency to hear more of a central Igbo there, because everybody needs to get as much patronage as possible. So you don't want to go speaking your own Olundi to somebody that may not understand. So immediately you switch to central and try to get your money immediately. So this is how these things develop, and this is how the central dialects came up to prominence because they were not prominent before, because nobody needed it. You see, so as Igboland develops and mixes up more and more, there is greater and greater use of this central dialect for people to be able to communicate effectively and connect with each other and foster unity. So this is just us talking about how the Igbo language has developed, both the written, which is Igbo Izugbe today, and the spoken form, which we use for our communication between friends, communication in the business place, and all that, what you know as maybe a central Igbo. Some call it central Igbo, some call it regular Igbo, some call it street Igbo, some call it Anambra Igbo, stroke Elugu Igbo. So all these things we'll just talk about is how everything developed down to this point and why things are the way they are. All right, thank you very much for listening.